A reading from the book of Esther. When Mordecai learned that all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went through the city wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message from Mordecai, saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this." Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Thanks be to God.
The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
The Holy Gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ according to Matthew.
Glory to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
You are the salt of the earth, but if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. The Gospel of Christ.
So the season of Advent, as we talked about last week, is characterized by a sense of expectation and anticipation, and even endurance. One of the key parts of Advent is the notion that there is darkness around us and we are waiting the light to come. And so that is why we progressively see more and more light coming in through the Advent candle as we go through this dark month of December, which of course will soon have the shortest day of the year. But this theme of darkness isn't just literally about dark and light, but it's about things that aren't going quite so well. And as we looked at last week, we are informed of this theme by the experiences of ancient Israel. You might recall with Habakkuk, he had been prophesying that God was going to bring the Babylonian Empire upon Jerusalem to deal with the evil and wickedness and selfishness that he had been seeing in Jerusalem. He was not expecting to hear that God was going to say, I'm going to bring this evil empire to deal with the bad stuff going in among my own people. But nevertheless, that was the way it was going to be. And Habakkuk is actually quite fearful of this day coming. Well, it takes about 14 years. In 586 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon comes in and besieges Jerusalem, conquers the city, destroys the temple, and then takes the best and the brightest of the Israelites and takes them over to Babylon, which is what is now modern-day Iraq. And they are now in exile. There's no temple. They're no longer in the promised land. There were some people that were left behind that were just kind of take care of the fields and stuff. But like I say, the best and brightest of the Israelites are now no longer there. And so this creates that scenario where they are wondering, what are we going to do now? The people of Israel are now known as Jews because Judah becomes known as a province by that name. Later, under the Persians, it'll be the province of Yehud. Later, under the Romans, it'll be the province of Judea. But the idea is the people from Judah become known as the Jews, and this is where that label comes in to reflect the people of Israel now. So the Jews are now in Babylon wondering, how are we supposed to do this thing? We are still the people of Yahweh. We are still supposed to be honoring the one God that we are worshiping. And we can't do that very well because there's no temple anymore, let alone there one being in Babylon. How are we supposed to fulfill the Torah? How are we supposed to do a third of the laws that are given in the Torah? And it was a bit of a conundrum. And they were trusting that Jeremiah's prophecy, that this would only be for a time, would indeed be true. But in the meantime, there began to develop what would become known as the synagogue during this time, where you'd get 10 men together to form a quorum. Really, the Hebrew term is a minyan, and they could get together and read the Torah and discuss it and have prayers and worship, and that eventually became the synagogue worship that is still being done today. But they're waiting, wondering what's going to happen next. Well, 50 years after Jerusalem falls, Babylon falls as well. God made good on his promise that he would also deal with Babylon. And so as the story goes, it's conquered 50 years later in 538 BCE by the Medo-Persian Empire. And now the best and brightest of Israel are moved from Babylon over to Susa, which is the capital city in what is now modern-day Iran. And among them was Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You read about those in the book of Daniel. And then after that period of time, we start to see Cyrus, king of Persia, allowing Israelites to go back, allowing Jews to return to the promised land if they wish. And so in 4 waves over the course of 100 years, we would see many of the Jews going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple and get things established again. But not all Jews went back to Israel. Many of them remained in Susa and in Babylon. Many of them went to other parts of the 127 provinces that made up the Empire of Persia. And these who stayed out and didn't come back became known as the diaspora, or perhaps you've heard it pronounced diaspora. These are the scattered people of Israel all over the world. Well, we're talking about the diaspora in this episode because we're talking about the book of Esther. And the book of Esther opens introducing us to a king named Ahasuerus or Ahasuerus. That's in the Hebrew text. The Greek version of the book of Esther calls him Xerxes, which is a more well-known name. It's also easier to say, so let's just go with Xerxes for now. And if it is indeed Xerxes the first, then this is happening about 486 BCE. So now about 100 years after Jerusalem has fallen. Now, it's difficult to know with certainty if this really is the same time period because the events in the book of Esther aren't actually found in any records of Xerxes' reign. So maybe it's not that. There is a thought that perhaps it's really Artaxerxes II who reigned about 80 years after that, so closer to 400 BCE. Maybe that's when these events took place, because there are some parallels with things that we've discovered in that time period, but they don't quite match up perfectly with what's recorded in the book of Esther. So the book of Esther still ends up being a little bit of a puzzle. Does it describe something that actually literally happened in history, or might it be something more along the lines of historical fiction? You know, like if you read Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, there was no real Mr. Darcy. But the way that the story is told, it's completely plausible that such a scenario might have happened, right? The point is, what is the story trying to say? So if Esther is recording actual historical events as they went, there's something to learn from it. If it actually isn't telling actual historical events, there's still something to learn from it, and that's how we always have to approach the scriptures. So when we read the book of Esther, that's what we want to think about. What are we learning from this book? Now, there's another thing about the book of Esther that is interesting, and it was actually one of the books that was really quite debated about as to whether or not it should be included in the canon of Scripture. The Hebrew canon was established in 90 CE at the Council of Jamnia, essentially. And the book of Esther, they were really wondering whether it should be part of the canon of the Hebrew Bible. And the reason for that is because it doesn't mention God at all. You don't see the name of Yahweh in its pages in all, I think it's 12 chapters, I forget. You don't get references to God. Nobody prays in the book. And that's part of the reason why we have to wonder, should this be Scripture? This added to the debate when the Christian scriptures were being discussed in the 4th century, the late 300s. Should Esther be part of the Christian scriptures? Because it doesn't talk about God. Well, very early on, this observation was made that this Hebrew text didn't mention God. So a number of people, don't know how many, created another book that contained a whole bunch of additions to the book of Esther. And these additions, in a book aptly named Additions to Esther, included portions that would now have the name of God appear. Setting the tone at the beginning of the book, we would actually see the characters pray to Yahweh. We would see in a couple of letters that are written within the book that God is invoked in all of that. And so the book Additions to Esther is written with the Greek translation to try to make it a little bit more substantial and more spiritual. But no matter how you slice it, the original story doesn't mention God. And so the question is, why would that be? Well, there are a couple of thoughts. One of them has to do with what the book is ultimately doing, and that is to explain the origins of the Feast of Purim that is celebrated by Jews around the world even today. But there might also be another reason. And so let me just tell you the story, and then we will look at how we take it. So what's going on is King Xerxes is a guy who enjoys making good connections with the 127 governors that he has all around the provinces of the Persian Empire. And so he calls them in to have this really huge, lavish party that just keeps on going and going and going. And at one point, after certainly having had way too much wine and enjoying himself too much, he wants to show everybody how beautiful his queen is. And so he calls for Queen Vashti to come out wearing her royal crown so that he can show her off to everybody. And she says, no, not going to do it. Now, it's surmised that the reason why she said no, it doesn't say it in the story, but it's probably not unlikely that when he said, I want you to come out wearing the royal crown, he meant that that's all that she would be wearing so that he could show her off suitably, right? So we could understand why she wasn't interested in that. As a result, the king says, fine, you don't get to be queen anymore. If you're not going to do what I say, I don't need you, go away. And Queen Vashti is no longer queen. So then the king's advisors say, what you need to do now is call all of the young virgins in the empire and pick one of them to be your next queen. While this is going on, we are introduced to a man named Mordecai, who is one of the best and brightest of Israel, who got carried off into exile. And he has a ward. There's a young woman named Hadassah who is orphaned. And Hadassah is said in our scriptures to be Mordecai's cousin, but it's quite possible and quite likely that what is actually meant is that she would be his niece. So Uncle Mordecai is taking Hadassah under his wing and taking care of her as though she were his own daughter. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, but she's also known as Esther. And she gets to be included in this group of people finding out who gets to be the next queen. And so Mordecai encourages her as she is going through this. And sure enough, she gets to be chosen to be the next queen of Persia. So Queen Esther and King Xerxes are now a couple, and she's reigning as the queen. In the meantime, Mordecai, who is doing stuff for the royal palace because he's one of the best and brightest of Israel, happens to overhear a couple of palace guards wanting to overrun the government and assassinate the king. He sends a message to Esther. Esther tells the king. The king finds these two guys and gets rid of them and then elevates Mordecai into a higher standing because of his heroism and protection of the throne. So that's really cool. But there's somebody else who's above Mordecai. A guy named Haman, or perhaps Haman might be a better way to pronounce it. Haman is like the number 2 in the kingdom, and he's full of himself. And when he goes around traveling in Susa, he expects people to bow down every time he goes by. Well, Mordecai doesn't bow down to Haman. And Haman is really ticked off about this, and he's thinking that this shouldn't be the case. So he goes home and complains to his wife, saying, I can't handle that Mordecai guy. He won't bow to me like everybody else. I think I just got to get rid of him. And his wife says to him, why would you just settle with small potatoes like Haman? Why don't you just get rid of all of the Jews? I mean, they're all troublemakers, right? So you should just tell the king that, you should write a new law and get rid of the Jews. And Haman says, that's why I love you. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so he heads off. He makes instructions for a gallows to be made because he wants to see Mordecai hanged out front. But in the meantime, he goes over to the king and says, King, there's a group of people who don't really obey your laws. They're the Jews. We should just get rid of them all. Why don't you just make an edict and we'll get rid of them all? And the king says, hey, sounds like a good idea. I want nothing but loyalty in my kingdom. And so he goes ahead and writes the edict, and it gets sent out to all 127 provinces. As part of Haman's little game here, he decides to determine, I wonder what day we should make this happen. I know, let's cast lots. Let's roll some dice, also known as Purim, and find out what that date will be. So Haman casts the Purim, and it turns out to be a date 11 months later, the 13th and 14th of the month of Adar. So that's when all of the Israelites, all of the Jews are to be killed. And that's what the edict says. On that day, take up arms to eliminate the Jews from my empire. Well, when Mordecai hears about this, he is understandably distraught. He can't believe it. We're going to be wiped out. There's going to be a mass genocide, just like back in Egypt. We are going to be totally done away with. This is not good. And so he dresses in sackcloth and ashes to mourn. And this is where we get to chapter 4. So in chapter 4, Mordecai is mourning. And Esther notices this and doesn't know why. And so by using Hathach, this little messenger, there's this go-between between Mordecai and Esther. And through this, Esther learns that this has been signed. And so she's like, oh, this is terrible news, but what are we supposed to do about it? And Mordecai says, what you need to do is go tell the king. Make sure he's aware of this and make sure he knows that you are Jewish too, because she had been hiding her identity earlier. And she says, but I can't just walk into the presence of the king. Anybody who does that gets killed, right? It's a security thing, right? And Mordecai says, yeah, but you're going to die anyway with the rest of the Jews if you don't do this. And who knows, maybe it's just for such a time as this that you got to become queen, to be the one who rescues your people from the hands of this evil man. So Esther goes up to the king, and the king receives her favorably. What would you like, my dear? He says. I'll give you anything up to half of my kingdom. And she says, I'd like you and Haman to come for dinner. So they come to her place for dinner. They're laying down, reclining at the table, eating the food. And the king says, what really is on your mind, Esther? And Esther says, I'm afraid for me and my people, because an evil person is going to arrange for all of us to be killed. In fact, that's already going to be happening. And the king goes, what? Who is this? When did this happen? And she says, it's him. It's Haman. He's the one who's doing it. And the king says, are you kidding me? Seriously, dude? And then he goes ahead and arranges for Haman to be put to death on the gallows that Mordecai was supposed to be hanged on. And with that, Haman is eliminated. But there's a problem. When you write a law in ancient Persia, it cannot be rescinded. So how is the king supposed to stop this from happening? Because the edict has already gone out. Well, he writes another edict that basically says, okay, here's what's going to happen. What I also need you to do is make sure that all of the Jews are armed so that when people come to kill them, they can defend themselves. And so that was the solution to the problem. And when that day came, 75,000 people in the Persian Empire were killed by the Jews defending themselves. 500 in the city of Susa alone. And then Esther goes into the king and asks the king for an extension so that there's a second day in Susa where 300 more people are killed as the Jews defend themselves from their aggressors. And with that, the people of Israel are spared from being wiped off the map. Thanks be to Esther and to Mordecai. Mordecai, by the way, got Haman's position at the end of the story. That is essentially the story of Esther. Now, part of the reason why people wonder why God's name was not included in that story might be because the nature of the celebration of Purim in honor of this event is the most secular of the feasts that the Jews observe over the course of the year. Pardon me. What do I mean by it being the most secular? Well, it always happens in March. It's March 7th and 8th in 2023. And the idea of celebrating Purim, the way you do it is you give gifts to people who are in need, but then you have a great feast, and you eat and you drink to excess to celebrate this great deliverance. And it's said that you are supposed to drink wine until you are unable to distinguish between Mordecai be blessed and Haman be cursed. I hope you can imagine you got to drink a lot if you're going to mix those two things up, right? But this is the idea. It's this lavish party. And so the thought might be that because the book of Esther is meant to explain the origins of the celebration of Purim, they opted not to have God's name in it just so it wasn't associated with that kind of celebration. After all, the third commandment says, do not use the name of Yahweh your God in vain, right? But I think there might be another reason. I think there might be another reason why we don't see the name of God in there. And that has to do, I think, it's reflected even, I'm not saying there's a direct connection between Habakkuk and Esther, but in the book of Habakkuk last week, we acknowledged that after Habakkuk heard what was going to happen, and he was in despair about the idea that Jerusalem would fall at the hands of the Babylonians, he prayed. And his prayer was, Lord, I have heard of your fame and your renown. I stand in awe of your deeds. Renew them in our day and in our time. Make them known. And we talked about how Habakkuk would have known all the stories of the great 10 plagues against Egypt to deliver the Israelites from slavery, and how they miraculously crossed the Sea of Reeds, and how they were led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And Elijah had that showdown with the 400 prophets of Baal where God answered with fire from on high, and all of these miraculous, amazing events that had taken place. And Habakkuk is saying, I've read about these and I've heard about them, but I haven't seen any of them. God, would you do them again? And I think we have a similar situation here. The Israelites are under threat. Is this not the best time that we could expect to see God move mightily and in miraculous power? Perhaps, but that's not the way it happens. The way the story unfolds, it almost seems to be serendipitous or happenstance. A word that is often used is providential. It just so happens that Vashti is deposed as queen. And it just so happens that Esther gets to be picked as the king. It just so happens that Mordecai has a place of increasing opportunity in the kingdom, which just so happens to cause Haman to bring about this edict in the first place. And when Esther goes to talk to the king, it just so happens that the king finds favor with her. It's almost like things happen accidentally. But I think that is probably by intention. I think we would be quite wrong to think that Esther and Mordecai were not fully aware of the fact that they were the people of Yahweh in this entire story. Even though we don't see it, that they are praying, I would think that when Mordecai was mourning in sackcloth, that he was crying out to Yahweh for deliverance at the same time. When Esther said, okay, have everybody fast for me for 3 days before I go in to see the king, it doesn't make any sense to think that people were simply fasting and not calling out to Yahweh. It's almost as if referencing Yahweh didn't need to be said. Referencing God didn't even need to be brought up because it was a given. All of this story was done with the awareness that God is there, even though God isn't mentioned. And that's where I think we can learn something from this story. How many times do we kind of wish that we could see God's hand at work in some powerful and miraculous way, and then are disappointed when it doesn't happen? Or how many times do we wonder, how can I know that God is actually at work? I mean, surely if God's doing something, it would be noticeable. When we think of our faith and our walk with Jesus, we understand that the Spirit of Christ is present with us, whether we see something zoomy happen or not. We actually might have a difficult time wondering as we go through our life, was God doing that or was that just me? Did I decide that because the Spirit of God impressed it upon me, or did I just pick? Where's God at work? Where isn't God at work? Who can tell? And that's the point. God is present, period. Just as Yahweh was with Joseph the whole time he was in his Egyptian escapades, so it is that the presence of Christ is with us every moment of every day. Nothing we experience is being experienced without God being present. Nothing that we encounter is being encountered without the knowledge of the divine right there within us and being there for us. We don't need to have to sort out what is it that God did today, or when did God actually do something. Instead, as we read from the Apostle Paul, we are to be thankful in all circumstances, no matter what, acknowledging God and knowing that we are being sustained by the presence of God, no matter what happens, good, bad, or anything else in between. And so this morning, I want to encourage you with the story of Esther. Go ahead and read it. If you have a Bible that has the additions to Esther, read those too and see how it tries to fill out the story. But in reading it, take to heart this idea that these people are working through this story and know that God is always there through it all, even though he is invisible in the story. Amen.